Well, welcome to the Hard Men Podcast. Very excited today to be talking to Pastor Joel Webbon. Joel, you're down in Texas. You moved from California. I guess just right off the bat, I want to hear a little bit about your story. How did you end up where you are?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for having me on, Eric. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So I was born and raised in Texas, all kind of near the Gulf Coast. I grew up in Katy, suburbs of Houston, and then we moved to Bay City. Bay City's right in between. If you're on the Gulf Coast, you've got, Galveston up here, and then you've got Corpus Christi down below, and Bay City's in between in Matagorda County, one of the poorest counties in Texas, but just, salt of the earth people. And so more cows in that town than people, but the people were great. The cows were great too. And so, raised in that environment, small church. My dad was a pastor. He grew up Southern Baptist, and then he went Pentecostal kind of AG, Assemblies of God, when he was in college. But then he kind of, he held to the sign gifts, still being in operation, continuationist, but he kind of backed down to more of like a Wayne Grudem position. We became Vineyard. My dad switched the church over from independent, non-denominational Pentecostal church to a Vineyard church when I was in junior high. So I, read John Wimber and Jack Deere, those kinds of things, and then went off to college and went to Dallas, went to Christ for the Nations, which I would now look at as a heretical school, very much about like Jack Cole and some of the 1950s healing revivalists. They would be a big fan of like Catherine Kuhlman. We had Henry Hinn, Costy's dad, Benny Hinn's brother, come and speak. Joyce Meyer spoke, so a lot of prosperity, heretics. And so I did 2 years there, thought I lost my salvation because they would hold that you could lose your salvation. And I was, just wrestling with assurance of salvation, in part because of my sin, and those kinds of things. And then I transferred over to Dallas Baptist University and finished my undergrad in business and biblical studies and became a Calvinist. I guess that was right in between. It was the summer in between Christ for the Nations and Dallas Baptist. So in between my sophomore and junior year, Christ for the Nations was a 2-year school. Became a Calvinist by reading I can't even remember the title, but it was like Hard Conversations, Soft Chairs, or Soft Chairs, Hard Conversations. But it's Doug Wilson, so I didn't even know who he was. But that was all the way back in 2007.
Okay.
So 2007, I was like, all right, I'm a Calvinist, but I was like a Calvinist, but egalitarian. I thought women could be elders and, all that, Vineyard's egalitarian, by the way. And so anyway, so I wanted to church plant, the business, biblical studies kind of thing. Just had to be in pastoral ministry. Couldn't wait. I got a call in my life, all those kind of things. I would have done well to hold off, but I didn't. And the Vineyard was the main thing that I knew. And so I felt like, well, if I'm going to plant a church, somebody's got to give me permission to do this. So I went through their process. They approved me. It was very anemic, like hour and a half lunch with a guy who by the end of it was like, I love your heart.
I love your heart.
I love your
That's
heart.
Enough.
Exactly. That's enough. I love your heart, man. Go. It should have been, like, are you touching yourself? Are you looking
qualified?
At porn? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Can you teach? Do you have sound doctrine? So anyways, but he loved my heart and told me I could be a pastor. And so I went to California, because my mindset was very much, by default, I was dispensational pre-mill. I wouldn't even understood the terms, but by default, that was my theological framework, at least subconsciously, dispensational pre-mill. And kind of two kingdom, maybe not like radical 2K, like Escondido, Van Druden or Michael Horton, but probably like two kingdom, like John MacArthur. So I'm this Calvinist, so my soteriology doesn't fit with anything else, but I'm too dumb to see the inconsistency at that time,
Yeah.
So, but with the dispensational pre-mill, all that kind of stuff, I'm like, all right, Jesus is going to come back. This is all I knew. In a nutshell, Jesus is going to come back. It's going to be relatively soon. It's going to be in my lifetime. And what we're called to do as Christians is not really, don't focus on the culture, don't focus on politics, but just plant churches, make disciples. And if you're going to do that, if Jesus is coming back, in 15 years and all we're supposed to do is plant churches and make disciples, why not do that? Where the fire is raging the hottest. Now, if I really believe that, so even that I was inconsistent. If I really believe that, then I would have gone to North Korea,
Yeah.
I settled for California, went there, planted a church by God's grace. it started as a Vineyard Church, then we moved to Acts 29. So similar to you and Brian and, the story of that church there in Utah. But was Vineyard, then was Acts 29, and little by little, became complementarian, became cessationist, all the C words, eventually became congregational, instead of just elder rule, still hold to a plurality of elders, but with big decisions, primary issues, we would defer to the congregation. And then the looming big C word, over my head, was confessionalism. And so I'm doing theology a la carte, which is exhausting. And then eventually, it's like you're going through the line at a Luby's, and you got 3 plates on your tray. And we're going to get, the Kentucky Fried Chicken. We're going to get some of this, some mashed potatoes, some fried okra. And then you're getting near the end of the line and you look over and you see this little sandwich board sign, that says chef special, and it's a 7-course thing. And you're looking at your tray and you've got about 94% of the things recommended by the chef. And you have a choice to make at that point. The chef is right on the money, but 6% off in his judgment, or the chef knows best. And let's just go ahead and take his word for it. So I adopted the 1689 confession because I'm covenantal, as covenantal as you can be as a Baptist. So you'll have to humor me with that. But,
right.
I'm covenantal. I'm not dispensational. I would agree with like a lot of Arthur Pink's views on the divine covenants and so but I just couldn't quite get there with, paedobaptism. And so I was like, all right, 1689, that's where I'm at. And then embraced post-mill and, all these things. And then complementarianism, realized that functionally complementarianism, I would say people who are complementarian, not all of them, but a lot of them, they're complementarian in theory. They are androgynous in conviction. Right. So it's like the role is different, complementarian, but the substance of men and women is actually the same, androgyny. So I would say the theory is complementarianism, the conviction is androgyny, and then the function, therefore, is egalitarianism. And so, and I was probably right there, so a husband is head of his home, but really the wife and the husband should agree on everything. If they disagree, they should go get counsel from the elders and otherwise Christians, and it's never going to happen. But if it happens that they've prayed about it, they've talked about it for months, they've gotten counsel, multiple sessions, and even their counselors and mediators are saying this is 50-50, you could go either way, then and only then does the husband, put on the pants. And so that's functionally, that's egalitarianism, because that happens, maybe once in a 50-year marriage. So basically, I was egalitarian in function, complementarian in word, and androgynous in conviction, like most complementarians. And so, but eventually, embraced confessionalism, embraced patriarchy, biblical patriarchy, gendered piety, the things that you guys talk about, embraced postmillennialism, embraced theonomy, still believe that it's good, in this dispensation, for lack of a better word, in the new covenant, to have a separation of church and state, but realizing that the absolute evil and stupidity of a separation between Christ and state. So I would agree with MacArthur, that Christ, not Caesar, is head of the church. But then I would say, let's go a little further. Christ, not Caesar, is also head of the state. Caesar works for God. It's either, it's not whether, but which, Rushdoony kind of stuff. It's either God's law, theonomy, or autonomy, man's law. Demas being, the God, the people, that just mob rule and all those kind of things. So eventually embraced all those things. And once I did, kind of got pushed out by my elders, for those kinds of positions. The big thing was, we were already trying, kind of fracturing, because I was getting people, it's like I'm building a plane in mid-flight. I don't even know what I believe. I started too young. I wasn't ready. So all of that's on me. But I'm inviting guys on to be elders because I am convicted of a plurality of eldership. I don't want to be a one-man show. But the problem when you're not settled in your doctrine, right? We're always semper reformanda, so we're always reforming, but there's a difference in reforming on huge issues like, am I Presbyterian or Baptist? Am I a Calvinist or Arminian? Am I egalitarian, or am I patriarchal? Am I post-mill or pre-mill? Those are massive things. And so if you don't have those pieces, big building blocks, settled in your theology, then, you're it's like a bus, and you're inviting people on, and before they get on the bus, they're saying, where's it headed? And you say, I'm pretty sure we're headed over here. But that's subject to change because I haven't looked at the whole map yet. And so guys were coming on, and it's not really entirely their fault. They handled things poorly. They could have done things better, but they got on the bus because I told them it was going a certain direction. And then I started going a different direction as the Lord was convicting me of sin and helping me to better understand the scripture. And we realized we're not going the same place. And so that was happening like 2019. By that point, we had left Acts 29. Eric Mason in 2018 was, woke church. So we left over CRT and wokeness and all those kinds of things. And then we just started fracturing, like the Al Mohler and Phil Johnson, Lig Duncan, and Mark Dever and John MacArthur panel had happened at Shepherd's. We were there in person and discussing it afterwards. And to my horror, I was on Phil Johnson's side, and one of my other elders was, vehemently arguing for Al Mohler and saying Phil Johnson was out of line to ask those questions. Wow. The way that he asked them, his tone was improper. And so I'm like, dude, I thought we were on the same page. We are not on the same page. So all that's happening, there's already fracture in the eldership, with our theology and our philosophy of ministry, our polemic, whether or not we use a serrated edge. I'm for that. A couple guys are against that. And then boom, 2020 hits, and it's like all of our division just exponentially multiplies. And with COVID, two of my elders, hook, line, and sinker, believe the Imperial College model, 2.2 million dead by October 2020. If we didn't lock down, they thought the lockdowns were great. A quote from one of the elders was, Gavin Newsom is doing a great job. That was a huge...
That's one of your elders?
Yep. Gavin Newsom doing a great job. California is doing a great job. So I was just like, man, we are not on the same page. And I think the church should meet. This other guy thought that they shouldn't. And in his defense, if he was here on this podcast, he would say, well, I was going off of the data that we had at the time. And Joel, it turns out you were right. Of course, he never said that because that requires an apology, and people just don't ever apologize. Yeah. But
especially not on that issue.
Right, exactly. Yeah, people have changed their mind at this point, but nobody has actually come back and said that they changed their mind. They changed their position in terms of their action, but in word, they never admit that they were previously wrong.
Well, because the science actually changed, Joel.
Exactly. So that's what he would say. He would say, I was going off the data, and yes, Joel, you were right. He wouldn't say that because it would require humility, but he, hypothetically, he would say, you were right, but I can't go off of what you were saying because you were doing it on a hunch. And we don't make policy, and we don't make decisions based off of a hunch. We make it off of information, and the information at the time was XYZ. And what I would say is, but I thought we were Calvinist. You actually are the guy who talked me into a presuppositional understanding. Van Tilly and Voss, Greg Bonson, this presuppositional apologetic and presuppositional worldview. So my position wasn't that I had a crystal ball. My position was that data is not neutral. Neutrality is a myth. Nothing is neutral, including data, because data has to be collected by someone and presented by someone. Who collects it? Well, in large part, academia, the university. Who presents it? Well, in large part, the media. So we have the legacy media presenting data. We have, American academia collecting data. So in short, we have godless Yale and the godless New York Times working in concert. From our presuppositional framework and then just from logic and common sense, looking at their trajectory and their history of lying about everything all the time, do we believe this, or do we fly by the radar when we can't see, when we're in the cloud, right? I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know the future, but do we fly by the radar? And is the radar the CDC, or is the radar the Bible that says, do not neglect the gather? So those are fundamental issues that we, completely disagreed with. And I was thinking, I'm going to get to, go back to Texas eventually. The short answer when people say, why leave California? The short answer is I have children and I love them. And so, so I was like, I'm going to leave California eventually. And when that came up in 2020, it was just kind of a catalyst in the equation that made me realize, all right, I was thinking I'll leave 5 years, maybe even 10 years, but we can't continue to function together on the same elder team. Our differences are serious enough. Like Paul and Barnabas, we need to bless each other to go work in different portions of the Lord's vineyard, right? That's one of the ways we get unity. We try to persuade, we try to agree, unity of the faith, common conviction. But sometimes we have to settle for common care, unity of love. And one of the ways that we do that, good neighbors, good fences make good neighbors, Chesterton said. And so John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul, great unity, because they were on the other side of the country in two different denominations. If they were in the same local church, they would have killed each other.
Yeah.
And so like there are guys that we're united with, but we can't necessarily minister in the same local church. So I was like, we got to split ways. So either you got to leave or I got to leave. And you're the guy who says California's doing a great job. You're the guy who likes California. That doesn't mean he agrees with everything. He is relatively conservative, not as conservative as I am, but relatively conservative. He would have problems with California. But he liked California more than I did. And he's from, he was from New York, so going back home wouldn't be much of an improvement for him. Whereas for me, I'm thinking, all right, I can do this battle royale with my elders. And one, I don't think I'm necessarily going to win, because what I was pushing for, a third of the church disagreed with our decision to start gathering again. And so I was like, I don't even know if I have the church on my side. I don't know if I'll win this battle. And if I do, then what? So I win this battle and this guy goes away and maybe we send him to plant a church or something like that. And then I turn around to the congregation a few years later and say, I'm leaving. And the congregation would probably say, what I would say is, well, if you were going to leave anyways, why did you get rid of your best suited successor? The guy who actually wanted to stay, so basically I just realized, all right, I'm going to let him stay. The congregation loves him, appreciates him. They don't know all the behind the scenes. The congregation probably thinks, he's super conservative. They don't know that he was arguing the liberal side of things, behind closed doors with me. And so I'm like, all right, I'll let him stay. He's not a heretic. He loves the church. He loves the Lord. I don't feel like I'm selling out or compromising in that regard, setting up some guy who's horrible. I'll let him stay. He wants to stay. I was going to leave anyways. Let's just bump that up. And so we did. December 2020, we officially moved to Texas to plant a new church, Covenant Bible Church, and that's the story.
Yeah, it's incredible, Joel. Just, you're telling that story, and I'm thinking about, man, that's, like you said, it's such a radical shift for so many of us in the last, 15 or so years. What's interesting to me, though, is go back to Young, Restless, and Reformed. We both had connections with Acts 29, that movement. If one of us made that trajectory from Acts 29 and everything that entails theologically, kind of get into Calvinism, and here we are. I don't know what you call it, just sort of this post-mill Doug Wilson. Right. Look at. I would say to people, look at Joel's show list. You can go to YouTube and look at the show list, and you got Joe Boot, and you've got all these great guys, and so that's where we've come. But my question to you is, why do you think, what was going on culturally, what was in the water that so many of us have taken this path? As you look at that,
why so many guys have kind of left the young, reformed, and restless and gone the direction we have?
Yeah, and to sort of this like reformed, historical, post-mill, dominionist, like. Right. It's just interesting when you see so many people going that path at the same time.
Yeah. So I think two main factors: providence and maturity. So the second one, maturity. Part of the reason we've gone that path is because we grew up, and honestly, so there's a difference between a Calvinistic Baptist and someone who is Reformed Baptist. In the Reformed world, you need Reformed Presbyterian. Either way, Reformed Presbyterian or Reformed Baptist is different than just Calvinistic. And, John MacArthur would be an example, super grateful for him. But he would be an example of a Calvinistic Baptist. He's not Reformed. He's not confessional, not in the sense of the 1689 or the Westminster. He's not Sabbatarian. He's not covenantal. He's not congregational, their elder rule, so in every regard, he is Calvinistic, but not traditionally Reformed in the Baptist side of things, like the Covenanters, like John Owen. John Owen was, he was not Presbyterian. He was Paedo-Baptist, but he was not. The key word in Presbyterian is presbytery. So there's a lot of guys right now. It's funny, like, oh, I'm Presbyterian, I'm not Baptist. I'm like, okay, what presbytery are you part of?
None.
You're not Presbyterian. You're Baptist in polity. Yeah. You're just Presbyterian and in baptism, and so, and that's fine. Those churches are great. But, my point is that I think just growing up, and maturing, just realizing, okay, there's more than just tulip, the other, but then also it's part of its age, part of its maturity, but then part of it is providence. And what I mean by that is there were all these theological categories, entire categories, that we didn't know even existed, or if we knew they existed, we didn't think they were relevant. We didn't think they mattered because we were still living off the luxury of a nation that had been built and established on biblical principles. We were still, we were running on fumes, from the founders and, the original Covenanters and Puritans and all that, this Puritan hope, this city on a hill, that is America. Like, we still had the remnants, even though the foundation was beginning to erode. We still had some of the fruits, the remnants lasting over, the overflow effects of a nation that had been, theonomic in many regards and all those kinds of things, at least natural law, maybe not divine law, but natural law and all that kind of stuff, natural revelation. And so anyways, my point is, there was just so much that we were able to take for granted. And I think, the last couple years, all of a sudden, because Doug Wilson, it's like, why is he does he just like controversy? Is he just needlessly controversial, talking about slavery and defending slave owners, and obviously he wouldn't defend all of them. There were abusive slave owners, but he would also say there were righteous slave owners. And I'm looking at that and just saying, okay, that makes sense. But why is it important, especially if this is getting you so much flack? Like, why is that been a major tenet of your ministry, talking about the Civil War and how it was unjust, because if the Civil War, if it was just to go to war over slavery, to abolish slavery, then we should be taking up arms to abolish abortion. And him saying, but I'm consistent. I don't think that we should be storming, Planned Parenthood with bombs and guns, because I think it was also wrong for 650,000 of our sons to bleed out and die on American soil in the Civil War. And I'm like, all of that logically makes sense, theologically makes sense, but I don't see the relevance. And then, boom, CRT. And then, boom, intersectionality. Boom, the whole BLM and racial reconciliation conversations and reparations come to, like. And then I realized, the things that this guy's been talking about for 40 years that I thought were unnecessary, actually were necessary. This guy's been right for 40 years. 40 years. So then I'm like, okay, I don't necessarily agree with everything, but when you see a guy who's been right for 40 years and everyone else was wrong, then I kind of want to read his books now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's interesting too, Joel, because I remember thinking that I've read Doug Wilson probably since some of his early works, early 2000s, somewhere in that time frame. And even then, I remember reading him and a little bit of Rushdoony and thinking, man, these guys talk about statism a lot. I don't know. Maybe you're going a little too far. And now it's like, oh my goodness, these guys nailed it really 40 years before it hit the accelerant.
That's right.
And really took off. So I want to ask you about that. You mentioned there is, even in Reformed circles, I've noticed this. There's sort of the guys who are happy to be confessionally reformed, but it really rubs them the wrong way that Doug and others, I usually hear this as well toward, the Hardman podcast. But why do you have to be such a serrated edge? Why do you have to punch the idols in the face? Why do you have to be so in your face about this stuff on Twitter? And it really comes down to people don't like your tone, etc. Can't we be more winsome? And I'm not even talking about the people who just jumped the shark, like, Tim Keller. Right. I'm talking guys that we would say, like, brothers in the camp. I've had plenty, I'm sure you have, of, elders coming to me in the church and saying, hey, let's talk about your Twitter. I just don't like, and then I'll ask them, do you think there's sin? Did I sin? No, I'm just not sure it's the best. And also, I'm not sure if we can be friends.
The word, exactly. The word is always necessary.
Yeah.
Right? So first, it's always an attack on your character, right? This is,
I've had people ask me, why are you such an angry person?
Yeah. Why
sort
are
of
you
thing?
harsh? That's, that's the big thing. Like, why are you harsh in your rhetoric? And this is objectively harsh. And that person is, what they're doing is they're assuming that harshness is always a sin. So why are you harsh? Step one, you are harsh. Accusation, and there's no defense for it. You are harsh. This is objectively true. And two, because it's presuming that question is actually two statements contained in that question, and they're both presumptuous. Why are you so harsh? Number one, accusation, not a question. It comes in the form of a question. But
it's an accusation.
An accusation. And two, contained in the accusation are two statements, not questions, but statements. And they're both theological and they're both wrong. So number one is, you are harsh.
Yeah.
And then number two is, and harshness is always a sin. You know, and so in that, yeah, so I get, you know, and then the big question is, okay, you know, so first you have to talk them off the ledge of bringing charges and saying you're disqualified from being an elder, because
you're a heretic for
exactly
tone.
People go there. Yeah, exactly. Well, and they wouldn't even say you're a heretic. They just say your character. You're not qualified. Like, you're quarrelsome, you're harsh, you know, you're not gentle. You know, and so then you start asking questions. Okay, give me a biblical definition for gentleness, you know, or give me this or give me that, you know, and was Jesus ever harsh, you know, and you know, how would you process, you know, Elijah and the prophets of Baal? How would you process Jesus, you know, John chapter 2, fashioning, you know, a whip out of cords? How would you process John 8, telling the Pharisees they're children of the devil? How would you, you know? And so you have that conversation. And if the person's reasonable, okay, you can bring them back to, okay, you are not always harsh. Sometimes I think you are, though. Sometimes I think your serrated edge doesn't fall into the perfect biblical category in which Jesus used. But you at least have talked them to where these things, there is a category now for serrated edge. There is a category for righteous, harsh words, you know, and so you can talk them there. But then the very next question is, okay, well, and so they're you know, they're dialing back, but but is it necessary? Is it necessary? And that's kind of your question from the beginning, like guys in our camp saying, but is it necessary? Why is it necessary? And for me, I would just say it's necessary. Just the simplest way I could say it is, why is it necessary? Because God commands us to love people. It's necessary because we are commanded to love. And I don't think it's loving to winsomely walk my wife and daughters to the gulags. And that's what evangelicalism has done, Big Eva especially, is it's kind of like a 4-step process. It's number one, there is no culture war. There is no fight. But you're making this up. You're gaslighting. It's a boogeyman. So number one, there is no fight. Number two, okay, there is a fight, but it's too early to start fighting. Right now, we just need to be winsome. And then number three, you're fighting the wrong way. Okay, it's time to fight, but you're fighting too strongly. Like slow down there, because if you keep fighting like that, you might actually win. And Lord knows we're premillennial, and we would be doing God. That's right. We'd be doing God a disservice if the biggest thing God's called us to do is lose. We're fiercely committed to losing. So number one, there is no fight. Number two, it's too early to fight. Number three, you're fighting the wrong way because you might actually win that way, and we really need to lose. And then number four, it's too late to fight. Let's just be winsome in the gulags. Yeah. And that's Big Eva's strategy. And it's basically to render every biblical man impotent. It's to castrate every single man. It's to zap him completely dry of any biblical masculinity. It essentially says there is no theological category for fighting, but that's a really hard position to defend because clearly in the Bible there is. So you have to do a roundabout strategy. You have to say, there is no fight. It's too early to fight. Yes, there's a biblical category, but it's too early to fight. And then you have to say when, you know, okay, yeah, there really is a war and it's not too early anymore, but you're fighting the wrong way. That, you know, and then lastly, it's, you know, you go from it's too early to fight to it's too late. It's too late to fight. At this point, we just need to suffer well. We need to suffer winsomely. And so all that being said, why is it necessary? Because it's necessary because we don't have to lose, and we're called to love. If God has ordained that we would all get shipped off to the gulags, so be it. But that will occur, if that is God's will, that will occur after I've done everything that I can possibly do to be faithful and to be strong.
Right.
I'm not going to. Part of the reason the world, you know, our nation especially over the last few years looks to be confirming the pre-mill position is because the baked into premillennialism is self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So it's don't engage the culture, don't engage politics, you know, all that, and then it's like, see, told you pre-mill was right. Look at the way things are spiraling. Look at the way
you sowed.
Exactly, things are getting worse and worse. You know, like you post-mill guys are idiots. You know, like you think things are going to get better and better. Look, things are getting worse and worse. It's like, but are things getting worse and worse because the pre-mill eschatology is correct? Or are they getting worse and worse because you believe the pre-mill eschatology and therefore didn't put up a fight? There's a difference.
Yeah, it's such a good point. It also makes me wonder, Joel, as we're talking about, this is all related to, I think, evangelical leadership, Big Eva. I've talked about it. You've talked a lot about it. So I've thought a lot about this for the last couple of years. And there was a time where I thought, I think these guys are just deceived. Why are they being led astray by this false teaching? I think what we've seen through COVID is the veil was lifted. Doug Wilson and others have said this is an apocalyptic event in the sense of apocalypse and unveiling.
Right.
We're really getting to see what people's hands are. But I want to see, this is what I think at this moment. I want to see if you would agree with it, and if so, why, or why you disagree. But I think there's no way to look at this without thinking that Big Eva is bought. Like, they sold out to somebody. I don't think, cultural Marxism, CRT being one of those things where we know their plan was to infiltrate the church and its leadership. Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like they got to those people. I mean, they're not just like, yeah, maybe CRT is okay, but like Tim Keller is straight pushing it. Russell Moore is straight pushing it. They're peddling the smack on the streets.
Right.
Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, so that it's not just, so you're absolutely right, and probably more right than you know, or you may actually be aware of this, but they're bought in the metaphorical, proverbial sense of, and in that sense, they're bought because their hearts, their hearts are possessed because of idolatry. Idolatry is weakness. Idolatry is a foothold. Idolatry is a vulnerable point. If you have idolatry, if you're harboring idolatry, you can be bought. Those who love bribes, and the particular idolatry that many, but the one that just, screams off the page is, the fear of man, right? The approval of men. The Pharisees, Jesus says one of the reasons they were so easy to buy, in terms of corruption or deceit or all these kinds of things, is because they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. So the Gospel Coalition loves the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. Russell Moore, Beth Moore love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. So they're bought in that proverbial sense because of their idolatry of the approval of man. But then they're also literally bought. They're literally bought. I can't remember the name of the organization, but you can look it up. It's public information, and it is a fact.
Might have been Blackstone, I think.
But that might be it. But there's a specific Democrat-run organization that donated $50,000 to help support the MLK conference.
Yeah, it's a Soros-backed.
Yeah, exactly. So $50,000 from the Democrat Party, or at least a wing of that party, because they're like, this conference is good for us. And it was. They're absolutely right. The MLK conference was used by Satan to help Christians be further deluded and deceived to vote for Joe Biden. Like, that was a great strategy on the Democrat side. For those who actually hosted, David Platt and all these guys who were involved in the MLK conference, they should have known better. So that bought in the proverbial sense because of idolatry, wanting the approval of man more than the approval of God, and then literally financially bought by the Democrat Party. And that's just one example.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. The other question I have, is you go back to something, I've said this for years now, but I was just going back and reading, what is complementarian theology? And it seemed very clear to me, especially now, like a lot of the stuff, Mary Cassian was there, John Piper, Wayne Grudem. I don't believe that the intent was always wicked and evil, but I believe it was a halfway house from the beginning. Mary Cassian talking about, like, on the Gospel Coalition, like how they were definitely trying to be anti-hierarchical, and like she's talking in like Marxist language, basically. Mm-hmm. So now I look at it, and Amy Bird, like, there were people who took beatings. Michael Spangler, I was one of those people, took beatings for being like, this is a problem. This lady is going straight. She's going to be preaching. And, we took beatings because it was like, no, you guys are crazy. Right. She doesn't want to preach. She's just trying to, women are being trampled underfoot by all these like Bible thumping men, supposedly.
Nope.
Okay. So you look at that movement now, and I was kind of like, I don't want to say I told you so. And I'm sure other people are thinking the same thing, right? But clearly, it seems at this point, complementarianism is a halfway house to full-blown feminism. Agree, disagree?
Absolutely agree. Because what complementarianism, what it does is it's, in a nutshell, it says male and female roles, he assigned them. Instead of what scripture actually says, male and female natures, he designed them. Male and female, he made them.
Yeah.
Not assigned the roles or the functions. And so complementarianism, if it doesn't outright say it, it at least leaves this undealt with, to where it allows people to assume that men and women, are exactly the same. I think, Doug Wilson has said it before. It's like an ice cream cone that's, covered with, chocolate, right? And you got different, you've got different colors, so you've got the hard chocolate shell over the ice cream that's pink, and the hard chocolate shell over the ice cream that's blue, right? But inside, it's the same creamy vanilla ice cream. And that's men and women. No, it's not. No, it's not. I like what, Matt Walsh, what he says, like from the Daily Wire, that, you could dig somebody's bones up 200 years later and find out, oh, this was a man, or this was a woman, because it's all the way down to your bones, right?
Yeah.
The difference is, it is a total difference. Now, both men and women have been created in the image of God. God made man in his image, male and female, he made them. So mankind, But yeah, we're different. So we're not just different in our God-assigned roles, but we are different in our God-designed nature. And I think that what it does is the reason why it's a halfway house, and the reason it doesn't work, is because if you believe men and women are essentially the same in terms of design, but they have different roles in terms of what God assigns, then really that makes a subtle accusation towards God himself. Because what it says that the will of God is arbitrary, right? It's arbitrary, right? So it's like, so take the same example and to show the absurdity of the argument.
Yeah.
Birds and fish are exactly the same, but God has seen fit in his eternal pleasure to ordain that birds should have the role of flight and fish should have the role of swimming. It's like, really? Are you sure it has nothing to do with the birds having feathers and wings and a hollow bone structure and fish having gills and scales and fins? Like, no. Exactly the same. Either one could do either thing. Anything you could do, I could do better, right? The fish is singing to the bird. Anything you can do, I could do better. I could do anything better than you, but I'm not called to. Right? So
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
So that's Beth Moore. That's Amy Bird. That's Jen Wilkin. It's like, so can you do anything? Because I would argue it's not that a woman's not allowed to preach. She can't. Not just because it's not permissible. She cannot do what preaching, and part of it is, so we don't understand men and women, but we also don't understand the office of an elder. We don't understand preaching. What is preaching? What is the church? What is a pastor? What is an elder? And part of the reason we think women can do it is because one thing that we've taken out of all of our ecclesiology, the office of elder, the function of preaching, the role of the pulpit, one thing that we've zapped out of all of that is war. War, right?
Man.
So preaching has nothing to do with calling the troops into battle, right? Preaching has nothing to do with William Wallace going down the line, but if you would, just for one moment, be willing to take back all those days for just one chat. Like we've completely eradicated every element of war, fighting, victory, the triumphant and victorious church. All of that has been taken out of ecclesiology. It's been taken out of ordination. It's been taken out of the office of elder, the office of deacon, and it's certainly been taken out of preaching. So then why can't a woman preach? But if you see preaching as, yes, it is preaching that is nourishing and feeding the sheep, right? And we've truncated it to where that's all it is. So if it's just nourishing, well, moms make meals in the kitchen and give them to their kids, right? So if preaching is just feeding my little lambs, and that's all it is, that's part of it. But if all it is feeding my little lambs, well, it seems like women do a great job at feeding little lambs. They do that every day in their homes. Maybe women can make great preachers. But if preaching is also not just nourishing the sheep, but a prophetic function of calling out to kings and kingdoms and princes and principalities and saying, like John the Baptist to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have her. A prophetic function of the church that cries out to culture, that cries out to kingdoms and says, bow your knee to Christ. He is king, not just savior, meek and mild, but victorious and powerful and glorious king. well, that is a role that is fitting for men. It's fitting for men, and we just don't see it that way.
Man, that's such a good point. I never quite thought of it that way, but you're right. Preaching is warfare, and all the martial language that we find in Scripture that's attached to that. The other thing, Joel, that's interesting to me, we talk about preaching and our roles coming from nature, our physical natures, our sexual natures. One of the things that my wife and I were talking about the other day, and this was before I was even complementarian. So at the time, I couldn't have told you what my position was. But I said it always made me uncomfortable when women would try to get up and preach because they have high-pitched voices and it sounds like they're screeching and you have these narrow shoulders generally. And it's just a different thing for a man with a bass voice to get up there and thunder and call people to, as you said, call people to war. Beth Moore does it. Amy Bird does it. The few times I've made it through about 30 seconds of their preaching, it's like, oh, it's like chalk against a chalkboard. And so I asked my wife about this. I said, do you feel the same way? And she goes, it's horrible. In fact, I can't stand it. And then you look at the hymnody of the church. The Son of God goes forth to war. Like these were actually made for the bass parts to lead. And there's a reason for that. You know, the sopranos carrying the melody. You've got the altos in there, and the tenors are, you know, supplying to some of the beauty to that hymn. But it's fundamentally the basses are leading. So even in the way that we used to write music, we understood that. This is not written in the key of Chris Tomlin. There's something about and again, the nature of men, a bass voice, generally speaking, you just don't get them in women normally.
A bass and based voice.
And bass and based. Yeah, we just coined a new phrase. I love that.
Based is bass. Bass is based either way. Yeah. So
no, that's awesome.
No, you're absolutely right. And part of that, so you know, you're listing a hymn, and we could list with that, you know, Luther's famous hymn, you know, "Mighty Fortress is our God." But you know, Wilson says that there are not many battle hymns. And he says, you know, part of the reason is because, you know, anybody who's writing a song, you know, is going to write from their experience. And most hymnists, you know, the people who are actually writing these hymns, were not really warriors, you know, or they weren't living in their life, in their practical circumstances of providence, in a war type moment. He said, and that's why it's healthy. It's good to sing hymns. That's fine. You know, and I know there's some guys who would be exclusive psalm singers, and I understand that position. I don't think it's ridiculous by any stretch of the imagination. Our church right now, it's completely a cappella. I'm not philosophically against instruments, but I definitely believe that the lead instrument should be the corporate congregation's voice. And any other instrument that's being used is accompaniment. Period, because we got to be able to address one another, not just sing to God our private worship experience, you know, with the lights down and the music loud, but we're addressing God, but we're also addressing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So all that being said, I'm down for hymns. Our church sings hymns, but right now it's a cappella. It's just the voice of the congregation, and I like that. I'm not going to say it must be that, but I like that. That is in many ways my preference. But with that, we're singing hymns, but we also try to have a healthy diet of psalms. And the reason why is because, unlike guys who wrote hymns, the guys who wrote psalms, David being a chief one of them, they were warriors. And so in the psalms, you've got more battle psalms than you have battle hymns. And so part of the reason why the church is so effeminized and has such a built-in aversion towards fighting is because we've taken all the fighting language out of our churches, and not just out of our sermons, but out of our worship through corporate song. We don't sing psalms anymore, because if we did, it is so helpful as a preacher who's trying to be faithful and preach the whole counsel of God, which includes, you know, masculine aggression, and the kingdom of God has suffered violence from the beginning, and the violent take it by force, right? It's so helpful as a preacher to preach that text, but to preach it in the same worship service where we just sang an imprecatory psalm.
Yeah.
Because now, as I'm preaching that, people aren't looking like there's something uniquely problematic with you. At best, they're like, there's something uniquely problematic with this whole church, their whole liturgy, and the whole Christian faith, right? So at least it goes from, Joel, you're harsh, to the Christian faith is harsh, or I don't like the Bible. That's been one of the most encouraging compliments I've received lately, is people saying, I don't like the Christian faith because it's aggressive. I don't like the Christian faith because it's toxic. That is so, man, I can't tell you. I know it sounds facetious, but I cannot tell you how encouraging that is, because a few years ago, it was never that. It was always,
I
don't
that.
like you. Yeah. Well, they would have said, I don't like you, Joel, because you're toxic, because you're overly aggressive, because it was all rooted in me and my person, rather than, no, this actually is doctrine. I want to make it about you, but no, I see this is what the Bible says. But now it's shifted to where, people, instead of just dismissing me and my person, they're realizing, yeah, if I'm going to dismiss this, I got to dismiss the whole enchilada, because this isn't just Joel Webbon. It's not just Doug Wilson and their personal style and serrated edge and polemic and the way that they talk and their tone. No, this is embedded in the Christian faith. It's in the Bible. It's in the Psalms. It's in their singing. It's in the liturgy. It's in the sermon. It's baked into the whole pie. And so if I'm going to dismiss what I see as toxic masculinity, I've got to dismiss not Joel, but Jesus. And that's been super encouraging, people dismissing Jesus instead of just Joel. Because what I didn't like was people saying, I love Jesus, I just don't like you. Because then I know,
you don't understand
now there's not a 1-to-1 ratio. I'm not Jesus. I'm well aware of that. So there were times it is possible to reject Joel while loving Jesus, because there are lots of things about Joel that are not in line with Jesus, because Joel is a sinner. Okay, so I don't want to act like that's not the case. But there were many times also where what people were rejecting about me were things that actually did accurately, by God's grace, represent Christ. And but they walked away thinking that they were just rejecting me, and that they were accepting Christ, even though they were actually rejecting Christ. I think a person is far better off rejecting Christ and knowing it than rejecting Christ and not knowing it.
Yeah, at least they know where they stand, which is probably better for their soul in the long run. The other thing I want to ask you about, Joel, is you think about, I've thought a lot about this. I remember a couple months ago, I was talking to Andrew Sandlin, and we were talking about—
I'm not familiar with him.
Media.
Who's that?
Yeah, so Andrew's, he kind of came out of he's older than us, a generation or so older, New Rushdoony, was part of that Chalcedon ministry for a long time, Gary North, kind of those guys.
Yeah.
But Andrew's still around, still teaching. He does a lot of teaching with Joe Boot in Canada.
Oh, great. Yeah.
But one of the things that, cultural theology is really what I think they would call it, like engaging, against the gospel-centered stuff, but let's engage all of Scripture with all of life, more of the theological maximalism. So he has a lot of great stuff. We were talking about this, and I said, where's the opportunity for Christians and Christendom? It's not just about building the church. Obviously, that's an important thing. Culture flows out of worship, cultus worship, even sharing the same root words there. But I asked him, I said, where do you see the big area for Christians to win? Now, the way I would answer that question, I've said education. I think that Christians are just insane for giving their kids to pagans and saying, wow, I don't know, the promises must be no good.
What happened? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But one thing he said that surprised me was he said media. He said Christians have ceded the ground in media. So I want to ask you about that. Obviously, we're both engaged. We're on a podcast right now. We're engaged in the media space. You started Right Response Ministries. I just want to ask about that. Why did you do it? Surely you've got to see there's a moment happening where I think people's ears are opened. I really do think that. I have scores of people every week who are like, what is this post-mill theology of which you speak?
Right.
Tell me more about the law of God for all of life. I want to hear this. I mean, people that they're dispies. I mean, whatever. Yeah, it's been awesome. So just talk about your ministry, why you started it, where you see the opportunity there.
Yeah. Great question. So I started the ministry, first and foremost, because I don't get to decide how people come into sound doctrine. So, because if it was up to me, then I just feel like the entire thing is irrelevant. You can talk to, Nathan's in the other room. He's my tech guy and he's helped monitoring as we're recording right now. But Nathan could tell you, he'd be like, I cannot count how many times Joel has said to me, like, what am I doing? Is this, because the reason why I'm like, I sometimes doubt, that the purpose and the necessity of a ministry like this is not because I don't think that the theology matters, not because I don't think the ministry is important, but I just look at other guys like Jeff Durbin, Doug Wilson, Joe Boot, and I'm like, they're all better than me. Like these guys, I've been on this track for like, depending where you start counting, 5 years, arguably 2 years with postmillennialism, like 2 years, Calvinist for, like 15 years, but like postmillennial for 2 years, and theonomic for like 2 years and 5 years, maybe, hopping on board with, things like Sabbatarianism and confessionalism. And so my point is, like, I have been doing this, not nearly as long as other guys. And therefore there is a surplus of wisdom and resources and just maturity that other men have that is beyond my pay grade, as it currently stands. They're better than me. They are. They're objectively better than me. And so I'm like, why am I doing this? Like, yeah. I feel like my ministry should be, with my 20,000 YouTube followers, like every episode should just be, so on this week's episode, I want to encourage you again to turn it off and listen to Blog and Mablog.
Yeah,
exactly.
Go read Joe Boot.
Like, that's today's episode. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah.
But the thing is, God is sovereign, not me, and you just never know what path, if you will, God is going to use to bring people to the truth. So we're all trying. It's not Doug or Joel. It's Christ. But God uses different paths, right? So like our path is not an ideal path, right? So, but yeah. Like, going through Vineyard and then Acts 29 and then, like this, that is not, I would never prescribe that so this is how you plant a church. First, you need to be 23 years old and single. Second, you're going to want to be Vineyard. Third, you need to appoint a woman as an elder. And then 3 weeks later, remove her, which is exactly what I did.
No.
Funny story. So I appointed my first woman and only woman as an elder because I was embracing, egalitarianism and wanting to be Vineyard. And she immediately, within 2 weeks, moved to Thailand, which that was a convincing argument from God and his providence saying, Joel, this is how bad of an idea it is to make a woman an elder. If you do it, she will run to the other side of the planet. Right. So I kind of learned my lesson there, by experience. And then I got the theology on the back end of why not to do it. But it's like the one time I tried to appoint a woman as an elder, she literally went to Thailand. But anyways, that's not the right path, but that's the path that the Lord used. Right. The two, within the Calvinistic framework and Reformed theology, the two wills of God, his revealed will, his moral will, but then there's his perfect will, his sovereign will. And God ordains rocky paths that include suffering and sin and error, to get us to beautiful truths, to get us to solid ground. God ordains rocky paths to get us to solid ground. And so that being said, I'm not going to intentionally, I'm going to, throw in each episode things that I know are untrue because God uses rocky paths to get us to solid ground. No, I'm going to do my very best to be faithful to the scripture, to be sound in doctrine, knowing that other guys are doing it better. They are. And I want to give honor to those guys, because they've been doing it for 40 years and I've been doing it for 4. And if it wasn't for their ministry, I wouldn't know some of the things that I'm talking about today. So I want to honor these guys. But I don't want to just honor them and watch them. I want to honor them and join them with my little platform, with the influence that God has given me, with whatever gifts and tools I have, knowing that I'm not the sharpest, tool in the shed. I'm not the brightest crayon in the box. But the world is a big place and the internet is a big place. And there are certain people who they listen to Doug and they're like, Joel, I prefer you. And I would, respond to that person and say, you shouldn't. Doug is objectively better than me. It's not subjective. He is objectively better than me. But the Lord uses different voices. And I'm not God. I don't decide those things. So why am I doing Right Response Ministry? Because I have a message that nobody else has? No. I have a message that 95% of it I got from other guys who are better than me.
Yeah.
But that group of guys is few and far between. It's a small band of brothers, and we need every fighting man, right? Like when you're at war, we need every fighting man. We need that 15-year-old boy. I know it's not ideal, but we're under attack. So beat your plows into swords, and that 15-year-old boy, he is a young man, and he may not be our best fighter, but we need every fighter we got. And so into the fray. Into the fray we go.
It's so true, Joel, as you're talking about ministry. I mean, I'm thinking the same thing. Basically, I'm like, okay, every show that I do is like, hey, you should go read Joe Boot. Hey, you know who's really good? David Chilton. Like, just go read the book. Here's the review. Right. Go read the book.
Right.
But it is interesting. You're absolutely right. I was talking to Michael Foster about this. He just said, God in his wisdom, some people will listen to Eric and they'll think, man, this guy's a jerk. And they'll listen to Michael and they'll think, wow, he's great. And, whatever. And I think that's the beauty of local. That's the beauty of local places and people that, the other side of it is like in your church, people trust you. They don't know who I am. They don't know who Doug is.
That's right. Yeah.
They don't know Joe Boot. They're not in Canada. And we actually, in a large extent, we want to encourage that, like where people trust their pastors again. This is something that you've talked about, and I want to ask you about this trust with pastors. So I was laughing as I was listening to this the other night with my son, but we were listening to how to tell if your pastor is compliant with tyranny. Mm-hmm. And I loved it, number one, because I was like, I'm so glad Joel's dealing with this. But the reality is, we've talked a lot. I have, and Brian Sauvé as well. We've talked a lot about relocation. I relocated. Right. One of my convictions was you really need to find people who are on mission, who are fighting with you, who, we're rowing in the same direction. It sounds like in your church story with ministry, like I've been in a lot of situations where I'm rowing this way and elders rowing that way. And then in 5 years, it's like, we really didn't get anywhere. Mm-hmm. I mean, we didn't build anything positive. So I said, okay, we're going to move. We're going to join forces with these other men, and we're going to be a part of this courageous work. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of people whose pastors are in that like submission to tyranny, and it's evil. So I guess just what would you say to that guy? How do you know if your pastor is submitting to tyranny, and why is to a tyrant, and why is that a problem?
Yeah, it's a problem because your pastor needs to be somebody who can teach you, but also someone who can set an example. So 1 Peter 5, I charge, as a fellow elder, I charge the elders among you, shepherd the flock of God. And then, he goes further and he's, offering oversight and all these things, not domineering over those in your charge, but setting an example for the flock.
Right.
And as we seek to set an example, your elders should be your tallest men. They should be the ones with the broadest shoulders. They should be the ones with the best records, the most glowing credentials. They should be the cream of the crop. And that's not a prideful thing or superiority thing. I don't know how to set an example for someone who in every single category is further along in his walk with Jesus than I am. He's setting an example for me at that point. And that doesn't mean that there won't be somebody who's a member of your church who is better in one isolated category, right? So there might be a man in the church that's not an elder, but in one particular area, he's just been super faithful or just uniquely gifted and could run faster and maybe even lap one of the elders in that area. But in general, right, we've got too many specialists, too many experts, but we need generalists. And I think elders are generalists. They're called to be generalists. They need to be experts in sound doctrine, experts in, not just able to teach, proficient, but apt to teach, right? I think they need to be uniquely gifted and able to teach well. So there are some areas where an elder needs to be an expert, predominantly, I would say, doctrine and teaching. But beyond that, an elder needs to be a generalist because, right, elders get, we really like Ephesians 4, right? Christ, as the head of the church, has appointed gifts to the church because he's a good head and he loves the church. So he gives the church gifts. And what are these gifts? They're men. They are our leaders, and he's given 4 of them. I would argue for a 4-fold ministry rather than a 5. He's given apostles and prophets. If we cross-reference that with Ephesians 2:20, they're the foundation, with Christ being the cornerstone. So Christ is the head of the church. He's building a structure. And the first wave came in, right? The guys who lay the foundation, and that's apostles and prophets, and they laid a foundation. And you look at 1 Corinthians 3 and what Paul says, as an expert builder, I laid a foundation. Once it's been laid, it doesn't need to be relaid, right? So the apostles and prophets, I would say, are done. They're still functioning in scripture as they're exposited, but the prophets and apostles, those 2 offices were for the first wave of building this temple, this living temple.
They lay the foundation. And now we have evangelists and shepherd teachers. And I look at that as a shepherd hyphen teacher, really two different sides of the same singular coin, being a pastor teaches and shepherds. So we have apostles and prophets lay the foundation. And what we have now is evangelists and pastors building upon that foundation. And all of these offices are gifts to the church, and they're men, they're leaders to the church. It's a blessing to the church. And what do? They train and equip the saints for the work of ministry. And right there is where we need to be careful, because a lot of pastors will say, hey, the work of ministry belongs to the saints. And I would say, yes and amen. But what they mean by that is, if we're not careful, subtly what they're baking into the equation is, you do the work of ministry, I don't. I'm just an equipper. I'm a trainer. I train and equip, but you do the work of ministry. But that doesn't gel, for lack of a better word, with 1 Peter 5 that says, shepherd the flock of God, not dominating over them, but being examples to the flock. You cannot merely sit back and take a training equipping role and be an example. Being an example assumes that you're in the trenches with the saints. So you are training and equipping them as you're fighting with them, as you're serving with them, as you're building with them, right? So it's the sword and the trowel, right? You're fighting off and you're building at the same time. And it's not just you're handing out swords and trowels and teaching them how to use those tools, but then the saints are actually building the wall and fighting the enemy. No, you're handing out swords and trowels. You're teaching people how to use swords and trowels, and you also, alongside them, are building that wall and fighting those fights. You are setting an example for the flock. And so, all that being said, I know it's a long answer, but my point is, to your original question, how can you tell? Why does it matter if your pastor is a coward, or if he enforced masks, or if he shut down, the service for 4 months, or if he took away the Lord's Supper, because it wasn't hygienic, or if he didn't let people sing, even though the Bible commands that as an ordinary means of worship? Why does it matter? Why does it matter that your pastor is courageous? Because your pastor is not just a professor. He's not meant to, right? We live in a society where we literally have a phrase for this, a saying, those who can't do, teach.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking when you were talking about that.
But that should never be in the case of a pastor. Pastoral ministry is not for men who cannot do, and therefore they surrender to the role of teaching. Pastoral ministry is teaching and doing. It's teaching and doing, and you're only, biblically speaking, life and doctrine. The qualifications aren't all to do with teaching. It's also to do with life. Most of the qualifications have to do with the caliber of a man in his character, his moral fiber, and the minority report of the qualifications have to do with this teaching. So in biblical terms, it's not if you cannot do. And in practice, then there's still a role for you to teach in theory. No, in biblical terms, especially with pastoral ministry, it's only those men who have done in practice the best. For them and them only is reserved the honor of being able to teach in theory. You only get to teach in theory if you have modeled in practice being a doer of the word. So the reason why it matters is because setting an example for the flock matters. And you cannot set an example theoretically. You can teach a lesson, right? You could do a Lincoln Douglas debate and argue a position that you don't even hold as a personal conviction. You don't even agree with, and yet still argue the position. Like when it comes to just lectures, and it comes to content, and it comes to lessons and these kinds of things, you don't have to actually believe it to teach it. That's where we get false teachers. But the problem is, when it comes to the Christian faith, what the Bible says as a requirement for an elder is not just that he can teach the right thing, but that teaching of sound doctrine stems from a sound life. And so he is not given the luxury, the privilege of merely sitting there and teaching theory. He has to also be someone who is working with the saints in the trenches, setting them an example, and he needs to be the strongest among them. Maybe not in each individual category, but overall, as a generalist, he needs to be one of the biggest and the strongest men that other men can look to and say, man, that's inspiring. I want to be like him. Not just I want to know what he knows. I want to be who he is. I want to do what he does, not just know what he knows.
Man, that's so huge. And I think especially in our culture, that's the need of the hour. As you look at the church, and I just encourage guys, find local pastors, find men. We talk about this in our local context. Find men that you can point to and say, I want my sons to be like that. You should be able to say that about their wives as well, to your daughters, and to your wives. I want them to actually live like they live, and they're doing it well and with wisdom and all those things. And I think the church will slowly, like leaven, become a much healthier a body if we do that. Joel, it's been phenomenal having you on the show. I do want to point people to some of your resources. We'll include those in the show notes. Of course, Right Response Ministries. What are some other ways that you would encourage people to support, follow, and check out what you guys are doing?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the show, Eric. Super honored. It was a privilege to get to join you. In terms of following us, one, if you live in Central Texas, we're in Williamson County. Our church meets in Georgetown, Texas, about 45 minutes north of Austin, but it's a separate county. Praise God. So hopefully our police don't get defunded. But if you're in the Williamson County area, or maybe you're even in Temple, Texas, that would just be an hour north of us. We got people in our church who come from Temple. Come and check out our church. It's Covenant Bible Church. And so you can check out the website, covenantbible.org, covenantbible.org. So that's one way to follow us is if you're in the area and you don't have a solid church with a courageous pastor, come and join us. And then beyond that, with Right Response Ministries, those, in other locations following the content, YouTube is always a way that people follow us. So you can go to Right Response Ministries on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel, click the bell, you'll be notified with new content. But we also have our website, rightresponseministries.com, rightresponseministries.com. All the content is uploaded on the website. We also have our free app. So, it doesn't cost any money and it's super user friendly and it can get you, away from having to use, things like YouTube. So if you want to do that. And then of course, for me, I always like to listen on the go. I don't like YouTube. People love it. But I don't like, I want to be able to multitask and do something as I'm listening. So, of course, iTunes, Spotify, those kinds of things, look up Right Response, but we have multiple different shows. We have Theology Applied. We have a show called Questions. It's just Q&A. I take questions from people who write them in. And then we have one called Daily Truth. And that's just like 5-minute clips from my Lord's Day sermons. And we just drop one 5 days a week, weekdays, Monday through Friday, early in the morning. So people, they can listen to 5 minutes of a sermon clip on their way to work or something like that. So.
Awesome. Well, we will definitely include those in the show notes. And again, Joel, thank you so much. And God bless you guys in the work you're doing.
Thanks, Eric.